everyone, welcome back to another episode of Back to Watercolors. I'm so happy you are here. And this episode of Back to Watercolors, things are going to be a little bit different. We're going to talk a lot about water control and how I use waters and how important it is for me to improve my water control in my watercolor paintings. The reason why I say this video is going to be a lot different than previous Back to Watercolor episodes is mostly because I'll be sharing multiple different paintings with you and showing you how I use water and my water control to paint the faces of the paintings that I worked on in the past couple of months, just so you can have an idea of what I'm striving to work on and also get a little insight into my watercolor painting process. I thought to begin with, we can start from the very beginning with this painting. It might seem familiar from the previous art vlog. I shared part of this painting process, but I didn't share much of how I use water to be able to make the hair blossom and flow in a way that I feel like is pretty unique to my watercolor process. To begin with, before I paint the hair, I like to wet the entire shape of the hair. By wetting the entire shape, it allows me to freely put a lot of pigment onto the paper without the fear of the pigment flowing outside of the designated circles of the hair. I try to be as careful as possible when I use my mop brushes with lots of water because I don't want that water to go into any other areas that I don't want the first initial pigment, which is the green, to go into. The goal is to keep the pigment in the areas where the paper is wet. That's why I have to be very careful when I use my mop brushes and make sure that the water isn't flowing into any other spaces of the paper so the pigment doesn't follow it. The reason why I use a lot of water in the hair is because I like to use my granulating watercolors when I do parts of the hair to bring more visual interest. The water before I drop in the granulating watercolors helps bring in more texture and allows the pigment to flow and do its own thing without me putting in too much effort. Next, I want to show you 3 similar but different ways I tackle painting the face. I have developed this technique as I have gone on to perfect the way that I paint faces. One of the things that I needed to learn that I didn't know in the beginning was how to move my pigment around. And what I mean when I say moving my pigment around is what you're seeing me do now with the first layer. I'm not going in an outline. I'm not filling out the outer sections and then moving in. I think that's a very common watercolor mistake and a mistake that I make a lot when I first started painting faces, was outlining and then trying to fill in that outline. And what I learned from watching a gouache video was that you want to keep your brush moving. Even if you didn't miss a spot, you can always go over it again with another layer, but you want to keep your brush moving and making sure that you're not trying to fill in empty spots, because you end up lifting the layer that you had before up and it just makes everything look really messy and very uneven. If you're looking for a smooth wash with your portrait, I highly recommend practicing just moving fluidly throughout your painting and making sure that you're not lifting your brush so much and you're not trying to go over the same spot multiple times before you let at least the first or second layer dry just a little bit. Your paper can still be wet, but you don't want to keep re-wetting it and you don't want to keep working in pigment before the layer has dried a little bit more. And that's definitely something that I had to learn over time, because my portraits, if you look back at some of my older artwork, they came out very streaky because I was trying to rework the same parts of the painting multiple times without letting layers dry, and I wasn't properly moving my brush around and working with the wet paper and my pigment correctly. I think I also fell into the trap of writing off my lack of understanding of how like watercolors and gouache worked with water control in your paintings by saying that it's my style and trying to embrace something that I didn't necessarily like about my portrait paintings. And that video that I watched really changed how I looked at water control, and how, and with just a little bit of practice, I was able to achieve the look that I really wanted in my portrait paintings. So for this painting, you've probably already seen it if you've watched my previous watercolor videos, but I did tackle this painting a little bit differently than I do normally with my watercolor paintings. I still wet the entire face before I start the first layer, but I did render, I guess you can say, a little bit differently than I normally would. I feel like with this painting, it explains a little bit more of what I mean about not painting a outline and then working your way to the center. With this painting, I started from top to bottom and then gradually moved my paintbrush without lifting it as much as I could, move it down to the bottom. With the reference that I used to help me paint this portrait, there was a shadow layer, and I really want to get better at more dynamic lighting and more interest with my portraits. So I did render this one a little bit differently than I normally would other paintings. After the first layer, I worked in more of the shadow colors, and my second layer was more focused on getting darker shadows. With this painting, I also was using a new palette. I always use the same colors for my skin tone mixes, but I did throw in some of the vintage pastel watercolors here and there for pops of color, and I really liked how the rendering came out. Really like adding that pop of color here and there into the skin tones, and it kind of made everything look very dynamic, and that pop of color just makes everything less flat. I think this portrait came out very dynamic because of the different colors that I integrated into the painting process. And if you'd like to see more of that painting process and what I mean when I use those interesting colors from the vintage pastel palette, the link to that video is down below. And if you'd like to see pictures of the final painting, I will have my Instagram linked down below as well. With this painting, I did start out with the barest hint of pigment on my brush when I did my first wash of water onto the paper. I don't remember exactly why I did it this way. Maybe I was just trying something out, or maybe I just didn't really care that I had pigment on my brush from mixing it on my palette. But I think it didn't necessarily affect too much of the final painting, but it did change the way that I started the first layer of like darker pigmented watercolors. So I guess it technically would be my second layer. I think it did mess with my perception of how dark the second wash of watercolor really was, because I did initially plan to make this portrait a darker skinned person, even though it was a repaint in a way, and it was supposed to basically follow the trend of the previous paintings. But also reflect how different my style has changed, and I do prefer to paint darker skinned people because I just want to represent people who look like me in my art. Just because I feel like there's a thing in the art community that it's really hard to paint darker skin tones, and I just want to, you know, break that stigma and show people that it is possible to paint a wide range of skin tones and have them look nice and good and dynamic. So when I put the second layer on, I thought the skin tone was going to be different than I initially had, and that's totally fine. I still went with the lighter skin tone because it did match with the other previous paintings that this one was a repaint of. I think also the thing that I struggle with the most is when I paint side profiles, I often struggle with facial anatomy, like where the cheekbone is and like how to get the blush and make the face not look so flat. So I definitely think this was a good challenge for me to do, and I didn't want to necessarily mess up and have too many layers and have to start over. So I just went with the flow of what the painting was giving me. And again, sometimes when you put in the first layer of watercolor, it looks a lot darker than when it dries down to. So it's always important to let your first layer dry just a little bit before working in more layers of paint, so you can avoid lifting your watercolors, but also get an idea of what your colors are gonna look like once they're dried down a little bit more. I really hope you enjoyed watching this video and receiving a little bit more insight into my painting process, and got to learn a little bit more about how I tackle painting portraits. I'm really excited to share in the next Back to Watercolor episode the last painting that I was working on, because it is a repaint of a previous painting that I did, and it kind of also shows how far I've come in the last 2 years learning how to paint portraits and use watercolor and gouache, and you know, make my paintings a little bit more interesting as I go on in my art journey. Thank you so much for being here, and I hope to see you all in the next Back to Watercolor episode. Bye. Take care.